I mostly grew up as a California kid. Growing up in the Golden State means a certain familiarity with warm summers and fire risks. We worry that lightning strikes might set off a chain reaction that burns down the entirety of our natural spaces. Gender reveal parties that involve any kind of explosives. Or lost hikers who, for some unknown reason, light a flare instead of using their working cell phone to summon assistance. I acknowledge that the California I grew up in is this way because of an awareness of a challenging climate, drought conditions, and, frankly, hindsight. But for all that awareness, I was surprised to discover the tale of an incredibly large, incredibly dangerous explosion with civil rights implications that I had never heard of. A case of mass trials, mass incarceration, and segregation. As the dust and ash settled over the remains of Port Chicago and hundreds of dead sailors, the criminal case was just beginning. This is Conduct and Becoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, it became clear that war was coming to the United States and would require the United States advancing across the Pacific. Given those realities, the Navy began construction on Port Chicago, about 35 miles east of San Francisco in Contra Costa County. Port Chicago, then, was neither near Illinois nor a Great Lake. But the location was ideal. It was accessible by warships, but not directly subject to the whims of the open ocean. And the space was available. What started out quite small grew to support the simultaneous loading of 2 ships. The first ship to dock on Port Chicago was loaded on December 8, 1942, about a year after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Around 2 years later, in 1944, a contingent of Navy sailors worked tirelessly to keep warships fully stocked with what they needed. The United States was embroiled in an island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, working ever closer to Japan, and those fierce battles required fearsome supplies. To keep the war machine stocked properly, railroads converged upon the port, laden with just those supplies. What came in on boxcars had to be unpacked, transported to the ship, and reloaded. The Port Chicago Naval Magazine was staffed primarily by hundreds of black sailors. For a bit of additional context, the Navy had only begun accepting black Americans for service in the spring of 1942, and even then only allowed the young men to serve in segregated units. And the segregation ran deep. Black sailors could not even enter the mess hall, the chow hall, until white sailors had finished their meals. This all took place against a backdrop of conscription and a desperate need for able-bodied men. Reflecting the racism and segregation of the country more broadly, the officers tasked with supervising these sailors were white. By the Navy's own reporting, these white officers held, quote, low opinions of the 1,400 enlisted African Americans assigned to the base. They also held fast to racist tropes correlating intelligence with skin color. The job of loading ammunition into warships was physically very demanding, and the segregated units worked as stevedores and ammunition handlers, slinging cluster bombs, ammunition, mines, and other things that go boom in the night onto the Navy ships bound for the Pacific theater. Those who weren't assigned to carry explosives were assigned to primarily construction battalions, another back-breaking endeavor. The rare few assigned to ships and submarines worked as stewards and messmen. They waited on and served white sailors and officers. Port Chicago operated 24 hours a day, constantly turning ships over, loading them up and sending them out. The young men that loaded the ships were trained in how to handle cargo, but not how to handle live bombs slathered in grease to make rolling them down a plank to their next position easier. The Navy refused to provide work gloves, and sailors depended on their families to send them that very basic protective gear. Whatever the men learned, they learned experientially, on the job. They weren't trained in accordance with the Coast Guard's comprehensive safety regulations governing the handling of military explosives in domestic ports. The Coast Guard issued that guidance in October 1943, and by November 1943, the Navy officer responsible for operations at Port Chicago rejected it by letter to the captain of the port. Navy historians theorize that it was racism that prevented white officers from providing in-depth practical instructions, but that racism didn't stop the junior officers from placing bets on the speed with which the enlisted men worked, pushing them to work faster for their own personal gain, and without regard for the safety implications of rushing around with literal bombs. To get the men to move fast, the officers dangled off-base passes as their carrot. The opportunity to get away from the on-base hustle and bustle and to get out into the city and relax. Late into the evening on July 17, 1944, hundreds of sailors worked to finish loading the SS E.A. Bryan and the SS Quinault Victory. The E.A. Bryan was nearly complete, nearly ready to send out on its second voyage, this time bearing a new airborne anti-submarine depth charge, incendiary bombs, cluster bombs, and 1,000-pound bombs. In total, sailors loaded 4,606 tons of ammunition and explosives into the E.A. Bryan. When sailors found that the munitions were packed in too tightly into rail boxcars, they reached for their handy-dandy crowbars to help unstick them. In total, 16 rail cars waited on the pier with 429 additional tons of ammunition. At 10:18 p.m., the wrench and splintering of wood sounded out, followed by twin blasts, detonating the ordnance and ammunition aboard both ships and in the 16 boxcars. An immense column of fire mushroomed into the air, casting a yellow-orange light. The Richter scale registered a quake of 3.4 magnitude, which is the equivalent of about 11 million pounds of TNT exploding simultaneously. People as far away as Boulder City, Nevada, felt the ensuing shockwave. These ships truly exploded, fracturing into pieces from the inside out. The largest remaining pieces of the E.A. Bryan were only the size of a suitcase. A passing plane flying at 9,000 feet reported white-hot metal surging past their aircraft. As the Quinault Victory exploded, it spun up into the air. The bow, with the mast still attached, rode a 200-foot column of water away from the initial blast site. A chunk of the Quinault Victory landed over 5 football fields away in Suisun Bay. Everything within 1,000 feet of the ships was just gone, decimated by the blast. That included cargo ships, the pier, boxcars, a 45-ton diesel train engine, a Coast Guard barge, and a nearby wharf. The blast even caused damage all the way in San Francisco. Metal and glass shards and unexploded shells showered back to Earth as far as 2 miles away. All 320 men on duty were killed, and another 390 were injured, many quite seriously. While the dead were predominantly sailors, they also included civilians, Coast Guardsmen, members of the U.S. Maritime Service, and 1 Marine. But black sailors accounted for nearly 75% of the fatalities. This single incident accounted for 15% of black American casualties in World War II. Sailors lucky enough to escape with their lives had to figure out how to move forward, but their options were limited depending on their race. White supervising officers at Port Chicago were granted 30 days hardship leave to begin to deal with the deeply traumatic event that they witnessed. And I'm not trying to suggest that those officers shouldn't have been granted the leave, but I am highlighting it because black sailors were denied hardship leave across the board, and were instead tasked first with searching for survivors. It quickly became clear that what was required was not a search for the living, but the recovery of the dead. Men walked through air heavy with the smell of burning flesh and loaded the body parts of their fallen friends and comrades into baskets. In the end, only 51 of the 320 remains were identifiable. 44 sets of remains were interred at Golden Gate National Cemetery. 2 weeks after the disaster, the Navy held a memorial ceremony for the lives lost. Admiral Wright addressed the horrific loss of life before turning to the need to keep the base operating during the time of war. The Navy asked Congress to give each victim's family $5,000. A representative from Mississippi insisted on reducing the amount to just $2,000 when he learned that the majority of the dead men were black. Congress settled on $3,000, the modern equivalent of which is about $53,552. A nearby naval installation handled the investigation and began to interview survivors to piece together what happened. The investigators spoke with 120 witnesses over the course of 39 days. Though they couldn't determine the exact cause of the initial explosion, they cleared the white officers of any culpability or liability and implied in their report that the black ammunition handlers were to blame. They contorted themselves to explain why the captain who rejected Coast Guard safety standards was not at fault, but the inadequately trained and undersupplied men were. They suggested the Coast Guard regulations were too onerous and that the Navy should carry on business as usual without offering additional training. Indeed, they believed it was the only way to support the war effort adequately. Before the investigation was even complete, about 3 weeks after the disaster, the survivors of the Port Chicago explosion were ordered to begin loading the San Gay at Mare Island Ammunition Depot in Vallejo. 258 survivors refused and demanded training. They feared another devastating explosion if they were still denied proper training. Instead of offering training, the officers in charge at Mare Island provided stern warnings followed by threats. 208 men gave in to the pressure and returned to work, though the Navy still pursued charges against them in special courts-martial. They were sentenced to bad conduct discharges and the forfeit of 3 months' pay for disobeying orders. The discharges were suspended and the forfeitures were reduced. 1 conviction was set aside for insufficient evidence. The remaining 50 who further refused to return to loading ships were singled out for general courts-martial to face charges of mutiny. Given the gravity of mutiny, it's considered a capital offense. The supposed mutineers were taken to Camp Shoemaker, questioned, and confined in the brig. They were asked to sign statements summarizing their interrogations that didn't quite line up with the actual statements they made. Some of the men refused to sign, others were ordered to sign and felt uncomfortable disobeying a second order. Some refused to give any statement at all, while still others thought the officer they spoke with was their defense counsel. The Navy convened a mass court-martial for all 50, charging and convicting them for conspiracy to commit mutiny. They reasoned that disobeying orders in wartime was tantamount to usurping the authority of the base commander. This court-martial remains the largest mass trial the Navy has ever convened. All 50 men were represented by just 6 lawyers, 1 lead and 1 attorney for every 10 men. A panel of 7 officers, who I think we can presume were all white, deliberated for just 80 minutes before finding all 50 sailors guilty of mutiny. Although the maximum penalty for mutiny is death, the 50 men received between 8 and 15 years at hard labor, reduction to E1, and dishonorable discharges. These discharges were also suspended, and the confinement periods were reduced to between 17 and 29 months. Thurgood Marshall, working as special counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, oversaw the appeal campaign but was largely unsuccessful on the argument that no direct order was given to all 50 defendants to load the munitions, and on the argument that the evidence introduced by the government was mostly inadmissible hearsay. At oral argument in Washington, D.C., in front of the Judge Advocate General of the Navy, he argued that the accused were made scapegoats in the accident. Of the 50, only a single conviction was set aside, though it was for mental incompetency. I'm not breaking for the Legal Beagle section on this episode because I think the most interesting legal tidbit is also the most shameful portion of the case. When the Port Chicago 50 were convicted, there was an appropriate, responsive uproar, and eventually the Navy commuted their sentences. But commuting a sentence doesn't mean clearing a record. In order for the Port Chicago 50 to forge ahead in peacetime without a criminal record, they would need to be exonerated. The Navy wasn't willing to exonerate the men, falling back on the reasoning that it was wartime and they did disobey an order. They didn't believe the men merited exoneration. But the thing is, it's not a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice to violate just any order. It's a violation of the UCMJ to violate a lawful order. It doesn't stand to reason that giving someone an order to violate the Coast Guard's guidance on handling military explosives in domestic ports just 3 weeks after a devastating and debilitating explosion of military explosives in a domestic port was somehow a lawful order. The Port Chicago 50 had 2 conflicting orders from their superiors. One to follow all the Coast Guard safety regulations, and one to ignore the safety regulations and fill 10 metric tons per hatch per hour, regulations be damned. I think it helps to have a bit more background about what courts-martial looked like in the 40s. A court-martial didn't have to include a trained judge and often didn't include lawyers. In the midst of a global conflict, investing in lawyers and judges was an expense that couldn't be spared. They needed men on battlefields, not languishing in protracted legal disputes in the courtroom. Instead of sufficiently qualified and trained men, because again, it was the 40s, and don't you dare even think about women serving as attorneys or judges in the armed services, the command dominated the court-martial process. The need for an impartial judiciary wasn't even identified until 1947, when the War Department submitted a report to Congress identifying a crisis of confidence in courts-martial. Service members didn't believe that a court-martial panel bound to a staunch hierarchy could return a finding of not guilty in the face of command pressure. I think the Port Chicago 50 are the most crystalline example of this problem. In order to resolve this crisis of confidence, the War Department recommended that the appellate court or courts reviewing a court-martial should have the power to review every case as to the weight of the evidence and to set aside sentences and convictions. Their recommendation was functionally a stopgap measure. It was an opportunity for uninvolved attorneys and judges to undo the mistakes made by commands running amok in courts-martial. And if you were concerned that I wouldn't find a way to make this feel real and relevant to you sitting here in 2024, I'll remind you of Episode 7, the Wilson case. In the Wilson case, the appellate court did what we civilian lawyers might call a massive overstep and reweighed the evidence of Wilson's conviction and adjudged him not guilty. The NMCCA was empowered to take that huge step because the War Department in 1947 recommended they have that ability. They recommended that courts of appeal be able to set aside a conviction if they themselves were not convinced of the appellant's guilt, instead of deferring to the factual findings of a trial court. But Wilson had the benefit of decades of investment in the legal corps. He had the benefit of a highly trained judiciary and of lawyers. He benefited from the full incorporation of the federal rules of evidence and robust motions practice. The decision in Wilson was, I think, a step backwards and strange undercutting of those decades of progress, somehow implying that there is still some serious deficiency of competent legal staff. Perhaps that's why Congress then modified the standard on appeal. But looking to the Port Chicago 50, the awesome power of an appellate court to step in and reverse a conviction in a process dominated by big feelings and deep racism, where defendants were tried as a group and didn't even have the benefit of individual counsel, that power to reverse a conviction makes sense. In an ideal world, the appellate court would have stepped in and done just that, even in the years that followed the end of World War II. Stepping in to reverse the convictions of the men suffering the ramifications of a broken system could have been life-changing, with ripple effects for generations. In the year after the explosion, the Navy began to work towards desegregation and integrated units began to pop up. In January 1946, after hostilities ended, all of the men did receive clemency. But clemency just means someone makes a decision to reduce the punishment. It doesn't undo the conviction. In 1994, a review board concluded that the courts-martial had strong and concerning racial overtones. The Navy nevertheless rejected a request by 4 California lawmakers to overturn the courts-martial decisions that same year. 5 years later, in 1999, then-President Clinton pardoned one of the few still living members of the Port Chicago 50, Freddie Meeks. His pardon petition was supported by 37 members of Congress. And a pardon is a step up on the clemency ladder, but it still doesn't seem quite right, quite sufficient. Pardoning somebody, again, isn't a sign that you believe in their innocence. It doesn't undo their conviction. A presidential pardon is just presidential forgiveness. It's offered after someone completes their sentence, and it doesn't change the character of a military discharge. This very nature of a pardon made many survivors refuse to even seek one. They didn't want forgiveness for an action they took because they didn't believe their actions to be criminal. Many of the survivors of the Port Chicago disaster, who earned convictions for standing firm in the face of pressure to return to unsafe work conditions, spent the remainder of their lives branded by their convictions and bad conduct and dishonorable discharges. But 2 weeks ago, 80 years after the Port Chicago disaster, the Secretary of the Navy announced the full exoneration of the remaining 256 defendants. the 258 original defendants minus the one special court-martial conviction that was overturned for insufficient evidence, and the one general court-martial conviction set aside for mental incompetency. This mass exoneration vacates all of the court-martial convictions, and legally these men are now considered innocent in the annals of history. Secretary of Defense Austin described the move as rectifying an old injustice, as the Department of Defense facing up to a painful episode in the DoD's history. Although this justice has been so long denied, it does strike me as meaningful that this exoneration comes during the tenure of the first Black Secretary of Defense. This exoneration came about because the General Counsel of the Navy reviewed the courts-martial records and related materials, and they found that the men were improperly tried together when they had conflicting interests, and were denied a meaningful right to counsel. Further, they concluded, the courts-martial happened before the inquiry into the disaster was even complete. The report would have been informative for the defense for the men, listing 19 substantive recommendations to improve ammunition loading practices. The Navy is currently in the process of tracking down the descendants of these newly exonerated men. Although there are no longer valid convictions in this case, this felt like a good topic to cover because of the differences between clemency, pardons, and exonerations, and the impact that legal advocacy can have even generations down the road. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we go to one of my favorite places in the whole world, the Pacific Northwest. Until then, take care. Conduct and Becoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct and Becoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.